Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today we've got a bit of a controversial topic, and I'm just going to state it right off the bat. It's this idea that everyone should squat deep in their training. So we're going to take a look at squat depth and where's the appropriate depth to squat, what are the benefits, what are any detriments, if any, and we'll make our final decision, and I'll share an anecdote as to why I think everyone should squat deep. All right, so first thing we have to establish, hey, what is squat depth, right? So here I have three diagrams to kind of help show us, hey, what should our body positioning be when we're squatting, right? And from now on, whenever I refer to squatting below parallel, what that means is parallel is going to be parallel relative to your femur in relation to the ground, right? So parallel lines would continue on without touching forever. In this case, it is represented by this red line, right? So this lifter is squatting just below parallel as their femur and their hips are dipping right below that line. Now, this is kind of an arbitrary area to call squat depth because this is usually what's in most powerlifting rule books. Now, for most of us who are not competitive powerlifters, this may not be as relevant. And this is one of the arguments that I hear as far as like not squatting deep and the arguments for maybe squatting high in training. And we can talk about the pros and cons here, but this is what I'll be referencing whenever I say parallel squatting. All right, so I have three diagrams here. The first is just below parallel, as you can see. The second is not parallel, right? This would be considered a high squat, as this angle is above parallel to the ground. And then this would be considered a quite deep squat. They're well below parallel, as their femur is straight below. Now, depending on your morphology, your ability to squat some of these depths may differ, right? If you have short femurs, that could affect how deep you can squat, and vice versa, long femurs, short torso. That's something to take into consideration. Now, whenever I made this statement right off the bat, as far as everyone should squat deep, I'm saying deep relative to your proportions, and in my experience, everyone can squat at least slightly below parallel. So this is going to be my point of reference whenever I say squatting to depth. That will be at least where this lifter is, right? And there are some benefits to squatting even deeper. And there's actually some benefits to squatting high at times, but as we'll talk about, those have some diminishing returns. What we have here are a list of excuses that we commonly hear. I'll hear this in conversation all the time about excuses on why someone can't squat to depth or why they may be saying that they shouldn't squat to depth. And I'm just going to come out and say it. These are simply excuses, right? So we're going to work through each one and why I believe that none of these have any merit to them for the most part. So one of the first things that I hear is, oh, I lack mobility, so I don't want to go outside of my range of flexibility, which in and of itself is correct, right? You don't want to force your body into a position that it could be compromised for injury. The problem here is people will use this lack of mobility as an excuse, and then they'll load up a ton of weight on the bar to squat to only squat down a little bit without trying to fix this problem at all, right? So instead, I would say you could really lighten the load and then teach yourself that mobility throughout your body's movement patterns and learn to squat properly light and then slowly work the weight up, and this wouldn't be a problem anymore, right? So this might be a temporary issue, but it's something you can fix. And most people who say this as an excuse are simply just too lazy to fix the problem. This one is my favorite, and I'm going to get more in depth with this question here in the next segment. Simply, squatting deep will not hurt your knees. If anything, squatting high will cause you more injuries. And my argument for this is because you are limiting the range of motion, right? And this kind of goes with the I'm not a power lifter, so I don't need to squat to depth approach. And it's the same thing I hear people say, oh, these are athletes, these are football players. They're only in this position anyway, right? I say, come on now, right? Hopefully we're smarter than that. Understand that if you can get stronger through a larger range of motion, that is going to be more athletic than if you are moving more weight through a lesser range of motion. Because if you are used to going through a small range of motion, and let's say you're on the football field and you're pushed out of that range of motion, that's where injuries happen, right? I have an anecdote that goes with this, right, from high school. And this is not a slight on anyone, but I was not taught to squat properly early on. So I had that exact mindset, right? Squatting high, putting too much weight on. And what happens is high squats really work your quads and the front of your legs, but they do not help your glutes and hamstrings nearly as much. So what happened was I was squatting a ton, I was working hard, I was getting stronger, but only in the front of my legs in that certain range of motion. So as the season approached, I was running a 40-yard dash and I happened to step wrong on the track and I tweaked my hamstring, right? Mild tear or strain in the hamstring, and that sidelined me for a portion of the season, right? I could not run because I tweaked a hamstring. And I attribute that to not squatting properly because I had this imbalance between strong quads, which is the front of your leg, and weak hamstrings, which is the back of your leg, that gets stronger in that bottom portion of the squat. And I was neglecting that. So we'll come back around to the hurting your knees trope. Okay. The story I just told goes into the handling more weight thing, right? If you're not a power lifter, why do you care what weight that you're putting on the bar in the gym? Makes no sense, right? To me, if I can hit a PR on the platform as a power lifter, if I could just squat 100 pounds each week and hit PRs, I would, right? It does not matter to me what people are seeing me do in the gym or social media, etc. Also, with handling more weight, you're putting more stress on your body, which is actually more likely to hurt yourself. So that's kind of the funny conundrum we get here is since you can handle more weight, you're more likely to hurt something like your knees or tear a muscle because you're restricting that range of motion. And then the last thing here, I'll hear, I'm not a power lifter, so I don't have to squat to depth. To me, I would think the opposite, right? Powerlifters are trying to squat as close to just below parallel as possible to be as strong as possible. If I was not a powerlifter, I would try and go through even more of the range of motion to build more musculature, right? The more you're moving through a range of motion, just like that deep squatter that was over here on the board, the more muscle mass you're going to build per amount of time in the gym, right? Someone who is quarter squatting or not squatting to depth, they're going to have to spend twice as much time because they squat, which only works their quads in that instance, and then they're going to have to go work on hamstrings and work on low back, things that would have been worked had they just squatted deeper with correct form. So this is one of those arguments, once again, does not make any sense. So what I have here is actually a diagram that I've stolen and kind of copied from a study that was done and posted on the Physio Network. So I'm going to post that link down below if you're curious to actually take a look at the diagram. I've done my best to kind of replicate what I would like on here to make my points as far as why squatting deep is actually better for your knees than worse for your knees. Okay, so that's kind of the conundrum we run into is a lot of times people say, oh, I have bad knees, I can't squat deep. The opposite should be true, right? Squatting deep should be better than your knees, better on your knees than squatting high, and we're about to go through why, right? So first we need to understand what are the two major ligaments that stabilizes our knee. And whenever someone says, oh, I hurt my knee, usually what are we talking about? Two of these main ligaments are the ACL, right, which is the anterior cruciate ligament, and then the PCL, which is the posterior cruciate ligament. Basically, they're shaped like an X within your knee, and they stabilize your knee. There are two ligaments in there. Now, I have drawn a diagram of, or at least my best attempt, of a calf. We've got an ankle. This represents the knee, and then this is the femur, right? So as you're squatting, your femur is moving at an angle, right? So I can use this ruler to represent the femur, and as you go down, that's what these angles represent. So this would be like a high squat, this would be parallel, and then we have a below parallel squat. Something interesting to check out is the peak shear force on the ACL. So the angle at which your femur is, and you have the most force on that anterior ligament in your knee, is between 15 degrees and 30 degrees of flexion. So let's take a look here, right? Right there is the peak force on the ACL. So my question is, why in the world would someone reverse motion, right, in a squat in the middle of those peak shear forces, right? That would, to me, would be where you're most likely to get injured. The same thing here, you've got peak PCL shear force, and that's a wider range. It's between 50 degrees and 90 degrees. So right at parallel would be where you have the most shear force on your PCL. Now, what this kind of shows me is, hey, I do not want to change direction in a squat, either between 15 and 30 degrees or right at 90 degrees. Because in those positions, I'm putting the most stress on my PCL or my ACL, depending on where I am. Now, I would like to couple this with something that's kind of interesting, the max quad use. So the muscle that is the top of your leg starts to come into play at about 80 degrees of flexion, so just above parallel. Your quads kick in the most, and that's going to be between 80 degrees and the entirety of the motion. So it's 80 degrees plus if you look on the chart in my link. At the same time, the max glute use starts at 90 degrees. So if you don't get below parallel, you're not using your glutes pretty much at all, right? You're not maximizing that use of the muscle. So what I'm seeing here from this study is if you are squatting high, you are putting more stress on the main ligaments in your knee. Whereas if you're squatting deeper, what happens, the stress goes off of these ligaments, and where you're changing direction goes into your quads and your glutes, right? So with that, squatting deep does not hurt your knees. It will help protect your knees, and at the same time, you will build more quad and glute musculature from going through this range of motion. All right, so hopefully that put things in perspective with a scientific approach as to why it could be beneficial to go through a bigger range of motion in your squat and not only protect your knees, but increase musculature and your flexibility and athleticism at the same time. I would like to kind of close out with an anecdote of mine, right? And my experience with squatting and my own knees, right? So, as some of you may or may not know, I am missing an ACL. I have a torn ACL in my right knee, and I also have a torn meniscus in there. Now, your first thought might be like, ha, you did that squatting, and this proves you wrong. But that's actually not the case. So, that torn ACL is actually from a traffic accident that basically someone ran a stop sign while I was in college. I had to jump out of the way, and whenever I landed, there went my ACL with it. So, in my experience, so the doctor said, hey, you have to get surgery. That's the only way to fix this. And my answer at the time, because I was 6 weeks out from a competition, it was 2018 Collegiate Nationals. And I said, hey, I don't have time for surgery, basically. Will it get worse if I continue to work on it? And she said, you can't tear it more. It's already torn, so go for it. And I found that because I squatted often and I had that musculature around the joint to make up for my missing ACL, I was able to function at a higher level. And 6 weeks later from tearing that ACL, I squatted over 700 pounds. I squatted 705 at Collegiate Nationals on that torn ACL. Now, that's not to toot my own horn or anything. That's just an example of how squatting to depth throughout my career set me up in a place to where if I had a knee injury, the musculature from all of that squatting could compensate. And that's still where I am today. I still squat multiple times a week to depth, and my ACL bothers me minimally because of all of that work that I've put in, right? So the next time someone comes up to you and says, hey, you shouldn't be squatting that deep, it's bad for your knees, now you have a little bit of background. You can say, actually, the data doesn't support that. And you could share with them, hey, I have anecdotes as well to back up that data to say, hey, maybe that's not the truth. All right. So happy squatting to all of you. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, check out some of my others, and I'll see you in the next one.